Welcome. Good evening. My name is Hilda Wong-Du. I chair the Programs Committee here at the Winchester Historical Society. Tonight, we are honoring Black History Month with a presentation by Nancy Schrock. Nancy presented an earlier version on the history of Winchester's New Hope Church to the Winchester Unitarian Society back in August of 2022. We thought it was fitting to share the history with the Historical Society and guests during Black History Month. Nancy has been a true force and supporter at the Historical Society for many years. She is the former president, a board member, one of the leaders who helped negotiate the original lease for the Sanborn House, a presenter, a painting rescuer, our collections curator, a trolley tour docent, and I'm definitely missing a bunch of things. Nancy is one of the first people I worked with when I joined the Programs Committee back in, I think, like 2014. And she continues to provide not only great programs like tonight, but also guidance and new ideas. And I am always grateful. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our speaker tonight, Nancy Schrock.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to see all of you. If you're looking behind me, you probably notice that this doesn't look like my Winchester house. I'm giving this program from our home in Riverside, California, where we live for the winter term at the University of California, Riverside. I'm delighted I can be with you virtually, and I'm happy to share with you the history of the New Hope Baptist Church and its congregants. So let's get started. This evening, we will just explore the history of one of the oldest buildings in town and the community that called it home for 70 years. Perhaps you, like me, have been intrigued by the building on 12 Cross Street. It is a home, but it doesn't look like any other house in Winchester. When I saw a for sale sign on it in 2016, I knocked and was welcomed by the owner, Robert Gavrente. Robert told me the building had been the New Hope Baptist Church when he bought it in 1980. He invited me inside where he had painstakingly restored the building, retaining the stage area and open floor plans so that I had a sense of the original church space. For many years, he had sponsored informal jazz concerts, which seemed fitting for buildings whose people had valued music so much. I also found that the building was among the oldest in Winchester and was one of 5 elementary schools constructed after the incorporation of the town in 1850. One of the driving issues behind the move towards incorporation was adequate public schools for the children of Winchester. But how did it become a church? And why is it now a home? To learn more about the building, New Hope Baptist Church, its congregants, and the neighborhood, I looked at a range of resources. We are fortunate to have an excellent archive, begun in the late 19th century by the Historical and Genealogical Society, the predecessor of the Historical Society. The collections were formed into an archival center during the bicentennial of 1976. Today, the center is located in Town Hall and part of the town clerk's office. The archivist is Dr. Ellen Knight. The Historical Commission recently completed a comprehensive study of the north of the end of town, which was an enormous help to me. But history is more than documents, photographs, and maps, especially if you want to know more about the ordinary people. The Archival Center has collected oral histories and transcripts for more than 25 years. I thank Robert Garante for introducing me to the three granddaughters of William Smith, the longest serving minister, who agreed to be interviewed and added to our oral history collection. Let me introduce them to you. From left to right, they are Dorothy Elizabeth Griffith Tucker, Winston Morris, and Linda Baker Berry. I am so very grateful that these gracious women shared their memories. I also spoke with longtime resident Douglas Cromwell, who provided additional information, and I used the previous oral histories done by Randy Bairnsfather. And now let us go back to 1854, 4 years after the incorporation of Winchester. The map shows the town then. Much of it was farmland, with mills and industry clustered around the waterways that run through the center. The arrows point out the 5 new schools scattered throughout town. The Washington School on Cross Street is in the north, an area known as Winchester Highlands. Each of the schoolhouses was the same: a single room with separate entrances, barricaded by a fence down to the street for boys and girls, with privies in the back, along with an outdoor water pump. An unmarried woman taught all 6 grades. Winchester's population continued to increase, so it wasn't long before additional schools were needed. The second Washington School opened on Cross Street in 1894. Here you can see it from Leonard Field. Next to it on the left is Highland Bethany Society, the forerunner of the Second Congregational Church. Then Washington School in the center, and the now vacant one-room schoolhouse on the right. The ethnic and racial makeup of the town was also changing. Here is the class portrait of the Washington School class in 1898. The gentleman in the upper left is Stephen Roberts, born enslaved, who became the orderly of Winchester native Nathaniel Richardson and returned north with him in 1866. His jobs included working as a janitor in the schools. Also in the photograph on the left, standing, is Mary Squires, born in Virginia in 1887 and 11 at the time. Her grandmother was an incorporator of New Hope Church. In 1901, the following article appeared in the Winchester Star on January 25th. The Baptist Mission has important work that should be encouraged and assisted. 10 years ago, you could count the colored people of Winchester, and I would say here, I am using the terms of the time, so you will find that when I use the term colored or Negro, it's a quote in the context of the time. Today, in 1901, they number about 150. The bulk of these come from Virginia, some from North and South Carolina, and a few come from Canada. The disturbances in the South and the social unrest of the colored people there have set in motion a tide of emigration which is flowing to the north. Winchester is receiving her share of the oppressed. Who were Winchester's first Black residents, and where did they come from? The 1860 to 80 censuses showed 5 to 10 Black people who worked temporarily as laborers and domestics, all born in Massachusetts or neighboring states. They did not stay long and did not appear in later census reports. By the 1900 census, however, the number had jumped to 150, the result of emigration from the South, with a few coming from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. They made Winchester their home, worked in its factories and homes, bought houses, and found an identity in their church. Thanks to census records and genealogy databases, we can learn more about them. My focus today is on the New Hope Church, so let's look at its earliest members. 10 families came from a single county in Southern Virginia, Halifax. Genealogical research identified Birch Creek, Pittsylvania, Halifax, and Bannister as their towns of origin. Linda Berry recalled her family coming from Finneywood, which was the name of an extensive plantation in Mecklenburg County near Halifax. Here you see Halifax identified in red. To the west is Pennsylvania, while Mecklenburg is to the east. Its south borders North Carolina. This detail shows the settlements too small to be called towns. Here you can see Birch Creek in the north, where so many listed their homes. On the right is Finneywood Plantation, and on the west you can see White Oak, which is the identity of the church that the founder belonged to. It's likely that the people who came to Winchester were the children and grandchildren of enslaved people. In the 1860 slaveholder census, Halifax County had a population of 25,900, of whom 14,000, 60% were enslaved, and only 650 were free people of color. Its economy relied on agriculture, and its major cash crop was tobacco, specifically bright leaf, which was used for cigarettes. It was labor intensive and relied on the unpaid labor of enslaved people. At the end of the Civil War, slavery ended, but daily life did not change much. Sharecropping and tenant farming replaced slavery, with the white landowners retaining control. A survey of tax property showed that the common dwelling was a log-walled house with dirt floors set directly on the ground. Forbidden to go to school before 1865, children could now learn to read, but schooling ended at 6th grade. A view of the interior. The period known as Reconstruction ended in 1877 as Union troops withdrew from the South, leaving former Confederates to impose Jim Crow laws that led to segregation. As life became more difficult for people of color, their migration north began. And here you can see the yellow route, the southeast route to the northeast. And this is the pathway followed by all the Blacks who came to Winchester from the South. But there's another interesting piece, and this is a story for another time, but a group came to Winchester from another Halifax. And it was confusing when I started to read the census reports and found that they were even more from Halifax, but from Halifax, Canada. I thought it was a mistake, but in fact, it was accurate. Loyalists in Boston fought against the Patriots, and they enlisted their slaves to fight on their side in return for a promise of freedom. When the Royalists retreated from Boston to Nova Scotia, they took their slaves with them. The promise of land and opportunity was not kept, and the weather was very cold. Some returned to New England after the Civil War. Dorothy Elizabeth said her father, Hezekiah Griffith, aided these emigrants and helped them relocate near Boston. Why did Oliver Barksdale and the Congregation of White Oaks choose Woburn and Winchester? We don't know for sure, but people typically choose places where they have connections, a phenomenon known as chain migration. Woburn was a station on the Underground Railroad between Medford and Andover, so it was known among abolitionists and also among enslaved people to the south. I also wonder about the impact of the Baptist Church as well. As we will see, there was a network of Black Baptist churches, Shiloh in West Medford, St. John's in Woburn, and others in Malden, Melrose, Everett, and Haverhill, and others. And this is a detail showing the Underground Railroad passages up from Medford to Woburn. Winchester really wasn't existing at this time. Another story I'd like to know more about is Dracut, because you can see on this map, it's called Black North. And there was a large settlement of free Blacks in Dracut. Another reason Woburn and Winchester were good places to settle is that the new arrivals found that jobs were available. The census includes occupation information, so we know the categories. Domestic jobs were available to women. In 1930, 45 Black women were live-in servants at homes on Bacon, Cabot, Calumet, Dix, Fletcher, Glen, Glengarry, Lakeview, Norwood, Swan Road, and many others. This photograph was taken at Six Cliff Road and shows Nanny Gardner, born in Virginia around 1900, with her charges. Domestic help also lived in the plains with their family and walked to work as washerwomen, cleaners, and maids. Men had opportunities as skilled and unskilled laborers. As with women, some were live-in and worked as gardeners, chauffeurs, and butlers. Most, however, lived at home with their family. This photo shows Spencer Jones and his family and his horse in 1910. I'd also have you note the houses on the back because you're looking into Harvard Street, which was the home of many in the community. Day laborer was a common term for many men, for several men who took short-term jobs. This photo shows men digging the foundation for a Copley Street house. The farms on the west side also hired temporary help during the harvest season. Black chauffeurs were popular. If you look closely, you can see the young man in the top hat giving a ride to his owner's dog. I mean, to his employer's dog, excuse me, please. And you can also see the Lyceum Hall behind you and the railroad crossing that's now the Rotary. Other jobs included courier, which is a leather finisher, glue worker, screen maker, barber, coachman, freight handler. Oliver Barksdale made a living in a tannery, pitching skins in the leach pits, one of the most difficult jobs. It reflects the factory workers, jobs that were available. We think of Winchester as a residential community, but in fact, it had industries from its beginnings because of the water power of the Aberjona. Like Woburn, there were mills and factories. You may not recognize this site, but this is the McKay Fastener Company, later the Puffer's Soda Fountain Factory, and it occupied 15 acres on the property that's now the site of the transfer station. This is the Beggs and Cobb Tannery, and you're looking at the corner of Swanton Street and Main Street. Imagine a town with that large a factory on it. John Maxwell's Eagle Tannery on Cross Street became the Witten Gelatin Factory in 1902. Woburn also had tanneries and gelatin factories that offered employment. Here is the lithographic view of the Witten Company. Here is reality. It faces the Aberjona before the Aberjona waterway was created. And it also shows why this was the last area to be developed, because it was so marshy. So where were the homes that the immigrants, and I would say immigrants in general, although we're speaking of the Black community today, this area of town was called the checkerboard. It was people from all nationalities, because these were the immigrants who were working in the factory and needed low-cost housing. They came in waves, Irish first, then Italians. And it's an area that continues to see immigrants arriving in our town and our community. If you look at the arrows, the one pointing right is pointing to what will eventually be Harvard Street, Florence, and Irving. The arrow on the upper right is property that will be bought by the church. The small left arrow is pointing to New Hope, the old Washington school, and the lower arrow is pointing to the gelatin factory. The area was finally developed in 1895 to 1910, when the Suburban Land Improvement Company laid out 100 lots between Cross and Swanton Street. Modest in size and affordable then, these provided homes for factory workers. By 1916, Blacks owned nearly half of the 51 houses on Harvard and Irving Streets. Sometimes families would rent out rooms to men who had come to find work before bringing their families. And you can see here we have, in addition to the single family, we have what I would call triple deckers. The need for a church was felt immediately. In 1893, Oliver Barksdale, formerly a deacon in White Oaks Church in Bannister, brought together fellow Baptists in his home on 18 Chester Street. The First Baptist Church, located in downtown Winchester, established a mission to Baptists in the Highlands. which was served by a series of young ministers. I like this young theology students would come out and serve in Winchester. This is the Reverend Thomas Bruce, who made a stir by putting on his overalls and painting the old school. I'm sorry, I forgot to note that the town rented the old Washington School to the mission so that they could begin to have their services near them in the north part of town. The people were active immediately, holding bake sales, concerts to raise money to help repair the building. For 2 or 3 years, there were disagreements. There were actually 2 groups of Baptists, of Black Baptists, arguing for supremacy. Eventually, the contingent led by Oliver Barkdale won and went to the Commonwealth and registered as a formal church, as the New Hope Baptist Church. And these are the registration papers. William H. Smith became minister in 1907 and guided the congregation for 30 years. He was born in Halifax County in 1870 and grew up on a farm with little opportunity for schooling. In his early 20s, he came north to Woburn and found employment in a leather tannery. He became affiliated with St. John's Baptist Church and began his education for the ministry through mentorships and courses at Andover Newton Theological School. He lived in the neighborhood, and here's his home, which for all practical purposes was the rectory. New Hope wanted its own building and purchased land along Washington Street near the corner of Cross Street. Remember that little square of land that jutted out into Leonard's Field? This belonged to New Hope. They hired Marsden Park of Boston, who prepared working drawings and submitted them to the State Department of Public Works in 1918. Here is the front elevation. Here is the side elevation. You can see it's rather grand and looks a bit like the early Methodist church and the early Episcopal church in town. Work never began, either because of World War I and certainly because of lack of funding. In 1922, Pastor Smith had new plans. He negotiated with the town of Winchester to swap the land owned on Washington Street for the old school building. You can see why the town would like that. They were developing Leonard Field for a playground, and this piece of land was jutting out into it. So in return, this town, the New Hope, got Washington School. The members hired Stoneham architect Elmer Chapman to design a church using the original school building. This was a wonderful find by Robert in the old church. It was the original presentation drawing on tracing paper for the proposed church. You can see a bit of the original church shape in it, but it was grander with peaked windows and stucco. Clearly, it was too expensive and had to be redesigned. And these are the drawings that were submitted again to the Department of Public Safety. A picture of this caption, it says, "As this is an alteration, no measures are given." And this shows for sure that this building was built on top of the church. The front will look familiar. The building itself is the same, and an addition was added on the front to create the entrance and staircase, and more space was added on the back. It's also important to see that there's now a large basement. The building was lifted up and a new foundation built. Here you can see how much taller the basement is. It's also interesting to look closely at the windows. You can see the small windows, large windows, and the writing below says, "Windows taken from M.E. Church." At this time, the Methodist Church was also demolishing an old church and building a new church. So they donated their windows to the New Hope Church. And Randy Bairnsfather, who was serving as acting archivist of the Methodist Church, indeed found documentation that proved this was true. Perhaps the most exciting piece of the plans is the basement, because it doubled the space available. By digging down and raising up, the architect was able to create what they called a banquet room and a classroom. In the back, you can see men and women's toilets and also a kitchen area, which had an enormous cast iron stove. So suddenly the church had not only space for their services, but also room for activities which were particularly important for the young people in the church. Here is the finished church. You can see it's transformed from the school. The stone basement is handsome. There's a new stucco surface and a new cupola. This is the only photograph we have of the interior, and it also shows a link between the churches that helped each other. The New Hope Church bought old pews from the Methodist Church. So you'll find that the theme of cooperation and collaboration and help between the ministers runs through the history of Winchester. Dorothy, Elizabeth, Winston, Linda, and Doug shared their memories of church life. Dorothy Elizabeth noted, "We had both morning and evening services, so I had to take a nap because I had to go to both services, which I didn't like very much. Sunday school was after regular services, and then we would come back for BYU, Baptist Youth Fellowship, where we teenagers debated like mad. That was followed by evening service. And then in between some days, the church was open because we had to practice for all our plays." Winston was a generation later. "When I attended the church, the Baptist population had dwindled, so we didn't have a big service at all. But there was Sunday school held downstairs, and they followed the Baptist curriculum. I did take piano and violin lessons, so when we no longer had a church pianist, I played the piano during service." Linda noted, "The church had a full basement that was used for all the various activities. If there was a wedding upstairs, there was a reception downstairs. Dorothy Elizabeth added, "Well, I know my father cooked a lot of pancakes. The men were great cooks, and that's the only time they really showed their cooking skills, is when there was a breakfast or something down there." They all remembered the outdoor Easter sunrise service. And then, quote, "Afterwards, we had this great big breakfast, which was wonderful. We had bacon and eggs and pancakes and sausage and biscuits and baked beans and juice and coffee and milk. Good smells coming from the kitchen, and everyone seemed happy. The whole neighborhood came." All of them recalled the July Colored People's Picnic held in the Salem Willows Amusement Park in Salem as the highlight of the summer, when they got to see all their cousins. Here's a picture of one of the pavilions. And here's a picture of the Colored People's Picnic. Churches from Medford, Malden, and Everett were among those who participated. It was a continuation of Negro Election Day celebration begun in 1741 in Salem. And it's now known as the Black Picnic, and it's held every July. The New Hope community lived around Harvard, Florence, and Irving Streets. Its children went to public schools and participated in sports. Here we see Robbie Robinson and Mason Barksdale with the Winchester High School basketball team. I'm happy to say that Robbie Robinson was finally inducted into the Winchester Hall of Fame for its athletes. It took a long time. Robbie Robinson played in the Negro Baseball League, finally quitting because he was not allowed into the American or National Leagues. And also about baseball, the boys there was a Negro Baseball League during the summers in Winchester, competing with teams from Woburn, Medford, and other towns. The Winchester team was known as the Harvard Athletic Club because the coach, William Guy, lived on Harvard Street. In 1930, the neighborhood sponsored 2 floats in the parade commemorating the tercentenary of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Floats, they prepared 2 floats, one representing the outstanding Negro characters from the Revolutionary days to the present time, and a float showing the progress of the Negro from 1630 to 1930. The church was well known for its music. And in 1950, at the 100th anniversary of the town of Winchester, they were one of the few groups invited to perform at the choral program. Here you can see they performed "Go Down Moses," arranged by Burley, and "Holy Art Thou" by Handel. But Blacks, as well as Italians and other newcomers, felt that they were not welcome everywhere in town. Winchester did not build a public swimming pool, for example. While the West Side had its boat club, country club, and tennis courts, the Plains had Leonard Pond across from the Whitten factory. The Depression hit Winchester, and the number of factories dropped from 20 to 13, and families did without maids. In 1940, Lewis Parkhurst of the Unitarian Church led a drive to pay off the mortgage for New Hope. In his article in the Star, he notes that the numbers of Blacks had dropped from 250 to 150 as people moved to find new employment. Oh, back here, you can also see the difference between the two buildings. It's hard to believe they're the same ones, but they are. The drive was successful, and the church continued for 30 more years, but numbers steadily declined. Some of the drop was caused by members joining the other churches, but there was also an exodus of Blacks from Winchester. Doug Cromwell mentioned it was simply that there was an opportunity, but there was also a growing feeling that they weren't welcome, and it was felt more by the generation between my father and me. My dad had never had any problems, but the children of his generation were the ones who left, like the Barksdales, who had been here forever. The Barksdales are an example of the dispersion of families. Daughter Martha moved to Washington, D.C. to take a job as a stenographer for the Federal Department of Commerce in 1918. Her parents and 5 siblings joined her. Simon Barksdale, oldest son, remained in Winchester on 12 Chester Street until he died in 1963. Education in the Winchester schools were important for all who came here. Son Richard Kenneth Barksdale graduated from Winchester High School, attended Bowdoin, where he graduated Phi Beta Kappa. He received a master's from the University of Syracuse and was the second African American to receive a PhD in English literature from Harvard. After teaching at historic Black colleges in the South, he joined the faculty at the University of Illinois and turned his research to Black literature. An extraordinary career and a tribute to his parents and all they went through to move up here to Winchester. I'm sure there are we don't have time to go into the people who lived in the Harvard Street area, and perhaps that would be a good topic for future talk. And I certainly encourage you to read Ellen Knight's essays, which appear in Winchester on History Online, which capture more of the achievements of these individuals. One area where the Black community participated was in World War II. And here you see the veterans marching upon their return. 33 Black men joined the Army and Navy and participated in World War II. The Guy family contributed 5 sons who participated in the war. Today, they are all honored in the plaque in front of Town Hall. But for those who wanted to remain in Winchester or move into Winchester or move out of Harvard Street, there was the issue of housing. I felt that Black people were destined to one area, and that area was set aside. I remember my father saying that more affluent African Americans tried to get housing on the West Side, and they would be steered to the Harvard Street neighborhood. And I think you can also realize that the returning military who were Black did not qualify for the GI Bill. So they would have found it more difficult to find housing in this town. Indeed, the redlining maps for Winchester of 1938 attest to this. Although Winchester had no red areas, the plains and the factory housing west of Maine to the cemetery were labeled in yellow as declining. While the Irish and Italian could move to suburban housing built in the former farms along Johnson Road, Black people could not. I'm sorry, the last minister of New Hope was Benjamin Berry, husband of Linda Baker Berry, with whom I spoke. She described the last years of the church. Ben began a few other non-Sunday activities like a bowling league, Epicurean club where they could go out to dinner. However, the average age was 70, so they were dying off one by one. When he took over, there were only 12 members left, but by the time the year ended, there were 6. The biggest activity he undertook was putting a roof on the church. It was literally caving in, so Ben got hold of the music director at Morehouse College, which has a fantastic traveling choir, and made arrangements for them to come up. We sold enough tickets to fill the high school, now Lincoln School, and had a reception at the Unitarian Church. It was a huge event, biggest of the year in town, except for the Anka Fair. And here you can see the support from the town. Here's the program: 4 Russian peasant songs, 5 Slovak folk songs, a German piece, and folk songs at the end. And here is the patrons list showing the support of the community for the efforts of New Hope, and also the ads purchased by local companies. While the church raised enough money to roof the church, it closed shortly thereafter. The building became overgrown as the Baptist church tried to figure out what to do with it. Church members wanted to find an arts group in town to purchase it, but neighbors did not want traffic. Robert found this old piece of paper in the church, and it says, "We, the undersigned, are opposed to the proposed amateur theater to be located at 12 Cross Street, the so-called New Hope Baptist Church." So there was neighborhood opposition to having it continue as an arts group. It was vandalized. It became a place where kids could drink and smoke. And finally, it was bought by Robert Garante, which required a special motion by the Baptist authorities. As you can see, he did an amazing job fixing it up. And had performances in it. He called it the Jazz Cathedral. And this is yet another story, the next life of this church. But I'd like to close with the words of Winston and Dorothy Elizabeth. I asked them before we finished speaking, what would you like current Winchester residents to know about New Hope Baptist Church? Winston replied that it should be preserved as a historical site because there's so much history of African Americans. And it's the only history left of African Americans in Winchester. And Dorothy Elizabeth Griffith said it was a place where we did and learned everything. I'm sorry, my face is covering up the quote. I have to change. There we go. We learned about Black history. We learned naturally about our faith. We learned how to participate in drama, and we learned how to give plays, especially at Easter and various times. And the final note, I would like the spirit of New Hope Baptist Church be remembered because, as the song goes, I will survive. This was a space for survival. This was a space where people could find out who they really were, not being defined by other people. And that's what I call a shelter, a place where you can come and learn about yourself as a person and get the self-respect, your own self-respect, even if nobody else chooses to give it to you. I would like to give my personal thanks to the people who made this possible. Dorothy Elizabeth Tucker, Winston Morris, Linda Berry, and Doug Cromwell. To Bruce Jones, who shared his photograph album with us. To Claire Dempsey, who worked for the Winchester Historical Commission to write a comprehensive report on the buildings of the Harvard Street area. To Ellen Knight, historian, archivist, colleague, and friend, who has contributed so much to the background of this talk. And to Robert Guarente, who brought the church building back to life, shared his memories, and has donated his collection of materials about New Hope to the Historical Society and Archives. To the town of Winchester, which supports the Town Archival Center. To the Winchester Historical Society, which preserves the Sanborn House and sponsors public programs that keep history alive. History depends upon those who preserve the past. Please join the Historical Society to support its efforts. And if you have photographs or artifacts that record Winchester's past, please consider sharing them with us. You can see by this talk that they do make a difference. Thank you.
I'm going to open it up for questions. So you can either use the chat function and type in, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Oops, I see questions coming in quickly. Well, lots of comments here. So, and Nancy, thank you. There's a vote here for part 2 so that we can learn more. More thank yous here. I have a question. So as you were going through, what did you find most surprising in your research on this topic? I know you've done many talks for us in the past, but what did you find surprising here?
I don't think surprising is the word. I think the word is meaningful. I found this the most meaningful research I've ever done, to learn more about the African American experience, how to get to know Winston and Dorothy Elizabeth and Linda, to find out about the town. I feel very strongly that we need to know more about Winchester's industrial past, its immigrants, how it was a place that welcomed people. I find it absolutely incredible that a former slave could come up, work in a tannery, pitching skins, and earn enough money to buy a house in Winchester and have his son go to Bowdoin and become a professor. That to me was probably the most moving, the most surprising. And can our town do it now? So other questions? I'm looking here.
Yep. There's a question here from Connie. When we last spoke last week, you mentioned the Underground Railroad. Can you please remind me of the role, if any, that Winchester played in that history?
Winchester played no role that we can see in the Underground Railroad. It wasn't really a town at that point. It was part of 3 other towns. And it was not active. Ellen Knight might be able to answer it. There were abolitionists in town. Frederick Douglass came and spoke here, but it was not part of the Underground Railroad, as Woburn was. Woburn was a much more developed, it was a town then, whereas Winchester was a network of villages.
I see Ellen out there. I don't want to put you on the spot, Ellen, but do you have any more to add to that?
No.
I know, Ellen. You should also always know when we see you in here. There's a possibility I might lob a question over to you. Let's see. We have a couple more questions here. What is the church currently used for?
It was bought by an individual. It's used as a home, and it's being used. I think I don't want to give the name of the person. It's someone who's very sympathetic and interested in the history of the church. So it was purchased by him. I think it would be interesting to see if we can commemorate that building, because I think, and that part of town, because it is part of our history.
I see a hand up also, Matthew.
Yes, thank you. Nancy, fantastic presentation on such an important topic. Thank you. I actually had a question on one of your early slides. It was probably in the first 10, and it was just before the class photo. So it was kind of looking across the field.
Oh, that's a wonderful picture, isn't it?
Yeah. I wonder, is it possible to go back to it for a minute, or is that too difficult in the moment?
I probably haven't. Well, I have to share the screen.
Yeah. I wonder if you have any idea of the approximate date of that photo. And
well, the new Washington Street School opened in 1894.
Okay.
The women were wearing long white dresses, so I would guess it's between 1894 and 1905 or 10. Ellen, do you know if there's a date on the back of that photograph?
I'm not sure. I'd have to look it up.
Yeah, I didn't find it dated in the catalog. I would add a plug for Winchester History Online. About, I think 3,500 photographs are now online through the town website, and that one is. The version used has been photoshopped and cropped to make the point I wanted to make.
Okay.
A little correction about that. That would be the Past Perfect online, not Winchester History Online.
Thank you.
I'm just going through here. There's lots of thank yous out here. Bruce Jones says, thank you for using my Jones family photo.
Oh, thank you, Bruce, for sharing them. They bring, there's something about those photographs that bring Harvard Street to life. I wish I had shown more of them, of the backyards and hanging clothes. It's just a completely different feel.
And another comment from Winston Morris. Thank you for your hard work, learning more about the town where I was raised. Our grandfather, Reverend Smith, and the start of the church. He bought the home on 9 Harvard street where I was raised. I appreciate all that you've done and enjoyed being interviewed.
Thank you, Winston, so very much.
And we have another comment here from Vince Dixon. Nancy deserves credit for great presentation, providing some of the sociological background. Do we have any other questions from the room?
I just want to say thank you all for coming, because it makes it all worthwhile to know, to share and to get the material out.
Well, thank you for sharing and all the hard work that it took for you to pull this together.
There's still so much more to know, so much more to learn. And also so much, I've just learned the value of oral histories, that if we want to be able to tell the story of our community and its people and get beyond Chapman and what government does and great people do, we really have to take a proactive role and interview people, collect photographs, and make sure that historians can find information and they need in the future.
Thank you, Nancy. Great point. So, Electra, I think you have a few slides and you're going to close for us.
Yes, let me share a few slides. Some upcoming news on some upcoming programs. And first of all, add my thanks to Nancy for this wonderful program. Thank you so much. It was really, I think we've all learned a lot. But coming up is, and we were just talking with Ellen Knight, she has a program on aviators of Winchester. And so we'll look forward to that on March 15th. And then the following month, we have an in-person event. And we're looking to see for a remote solution. But right now, this is going to be in person, the Fells Forest Festival, presented by Dan McKenna. So we hope you can make both of those programs. And as Nancy so articulately said, we are the Historic Society. We not only, a part of our mission is to preserve the history and share the history of Winchester. And we always need your active participation to really help this mission come true. And so we would love you to become members. We appreciate that. We do have a pet project. And for any, and a part of what we mentioned is we are the stewards of the Sanborn House. And so right now, we have an active drive going on because anyone is in a home and it has water coming in this case through chimneys, you get into real trouble quickly. And so we are looking to have a particularly active fund so that we can bring some money in so that we can help save these chimneys and see that there isn't damage and more damage in the home. If you haven't been to the Sanborn House, this was a part of a grant request that we put out there, really showing the challenge that we're facing with the chimneys, the water that is coming in and sort of what's breaking down. One of the rooms that is impacted is the gorgeous dining room. And that's the center chimney that's causing some water to come into that room. So if you can, we'd love to get your help in seeing that we can do the work we need to do to see that these chimneys are repaired. And so with that, I'm going to drop a link in the chat, which takes us to our donation page. So if you can, please consider making a donation. We'd appreciate your support. And so with that, I think we are at the conclusion of our program. Thank you all for coming. It was a true pleasure. And we hope you found it interesting and learned something too.
Have a good night, everyone.